In the past few months, relations between Russia and Azerbaijan have seriously deteriorated, even personally between Putin and President Ilham Aliyev. Among Russian propagandists, the idea that this state is hostile has been voiced more and more often, that its policy threatens Moscow's interests in the Caucasus region, and that, in the end, Azerbaijan should be dealt with like Ukraine, quickly and harshly, with the help of a new special military operation. Today we will look at the main events that led to the Russian-Azerbaijani conflict, analyze all possible prerequisites and reasons for this situation, including in the context of Putin's policy in the Caucasus. And of course, we will try to answer the main question: will a new war break out in this already troubled region in the near future? As always, an objective and balanced analysis of the facts. My name is Semyon Kanal Mega Show Television. Let's get down to business. How did it all start? I think in this situation it's best to start with one plane crash, when the brave Kadyrovtsi repeated the feat of Gherkin Strelkov from 10 years ago and shot down a passenger plane instead of a military target. So, on December 25th, 2024, an E-190 plane took off from the capital of Azerbaijan, Baku, with 67 people on board. It was headed for the Chechen capital, Grozny. As it neared its destination, the Russian Panzer's air defense shot it down. Minutes earlier, electronic warfare had paralyzed all communication systems. As it turned out, Kadyrov's fighters never learned to do anything more useful than filming staged videos and uploading them to TikTok. Anti-aircraft gunners mistakenly identified a civilian plane as a Ukrainian drone and fired a missile. Fortunately, even though the plane was hit by a surface-to-air missile, it didn't crash immediately and managed to stay in the air for another 74 minutes. Fortunately, the damage didn't affect the engine, wings, or other vital parts of the structure, which allowed the plane to remain controllable for a while. Later, when inspecting the holes in the fuselage, it was determined that the tail section of the plane took the main hit, where there were no critical control systems. However, due to the breach in the fuselage, decompression began, which required an immediate emergency landing. And now, attention. Question: what do you think the Russian side did? Probably they provided all possible assistance and tried their best to compensate for the consequences of their criminal negligence. Of course, they helped, and then they caught up and helped again. Realizing what they had done, the Kadyrovtsi gave instructions to the dispatchers to cover up the traces of their crimes and get rid of unnecessary witnesses. Despite the requests from the ABEX pilots, the plane was not given permission to land at Russian airports, even though there was an airport in Makhachkala nearby. Instead, the pilots were ordered to fly to the Kazakh city of Aktau, which is located on the other side of the Caspian Sea. In other words, the expectation was that the damaged plane would not survive such a long flight and would crash into the bottom of this largest lake in the world. And then, as they say, all traces would be lost in the water, literally, and no one would have found out anything. But the plane demonstrated real miracles of survivability, and the crew showed true professionalism. After being hit, it managed to fly at least 450 kilometers and made it to Aktau, but during landing it crashed next to the runway and caught fire. As a result, 38 people died, while 29 managed to survive. But most importantly, the black boxes. Instead of ending up at the bottom, they went to the Kazakh authorities. There were also surviving witnesses, which made it possible to learn the truth and share it with the whole world. With 26 of the 38 victims being Azerbaijani citizens, the case was starting to look like a major international scandal. Naturally, the Russian side quickly deflected, blaming technical plane issues or heavy fog. Familiar excuses, aren't they? But facts, as they say, are stubborn things. Then, 3 days later, the Kremlin dwarf finally apologized to President Aliyev because the tragic incident happened in Russian airspace. However, Aliyev demanded that Russia officially admit its guilt, punish those responsible and bring them to criminal justice, as well as compensate the Azerbaijani state, the affected passengers and crew members. And, as you correctly understood, neither Putin nor anyone else from his clique has bothered to do any of the above to this day, and they haven't even planned to. This happened in Yekaterinburg. But that was just the beginning. The demonstrative actions towards Azerbaijan continued. Putin couldn't forgive the fact that Aliyev openly refused to play along with him and cover up the incident with the downed plane. The Azerbaijani authorities continued to insist on their demands, which was completely unacceptable to the great and mighty Orthodox Tsar. And so he came up with a demonstrative response of his own. On June 27, 2025, in Yekaterinburg, Russia, the investigative committee made mass arrests of Azerbaijani diaspora members. Over 50 people were arrested for organizing murders and attempted murders from 15 years ago. And these circumstances made it clear from the very beginning that this was not about ordinary crime or the fight against organized crime. This was a demonstrative move by the Russian security forces against all Azerbaijanis living in Russia. Most importantly, two of those detained, brothers Gusein and Ziauddin Safarov, were beaten to death after their arrest. Of course, deaths from torture in Russian prisons are quite a common occurrence. According to the international organization Amnesty International, in 2023 alone, at least 50 Russians died from torture in police stations, colonies, and pre-trial detention centers. And what is there to be surprised about, really? After all, over there, behind the scenes, investigators from all law enforcement agencies continue to work according to the well-known Stalinist principle. Confession is the queen of evidence, and obtaining that very confession is their main task. But here, from the very beginning, the events took on a political tone. Ilham Aliyev couldn't stay silent, and in addition to official notes of protest and accusations against Putin's men, he came up with his own response. The blow was dealt against employees of one of the largest Russian news agencies, Sputnik, which also has a branch in Baku. Azerbaijani police arrested 7 people, including the editorial management, and charged them with fraud, illegal entrepreneurship, and legalization of property acquired through criminal means. Also, in several Azerbaijani cities, a number of Russian citizens were arrested and accused of both drug trafficking from Iran and various cybercrimes, with all these judicial and investigative actions receiving maximum media coverage. As a result, targeted attacks against Azerbaijan, its authorities, and the country's overall policy began to appear in the Russian information space. More and more often, calls similar to those that were heard a few months before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine were being voiced among the Kremlin's propagandists. And it became clear to everyone that the reasons for this conflict are deeper and more large-scale in nature. And the downed planes and killed Azerbaijanis were just the detonator. It was the effect of a hidden abscess. Now let's figure out what led to the formation of this pus. Russia is losing the Caucasus. First of all, I'll start with the geopolitical factor. But to understand it, we need to briefly outline what kind of policy Putin's Russia has pursued in the Caucasus region over the past 2 decades. That is, after the end of the Second Chechen War and the suppression of the national liberation resistance of the Chechen people. In short, Moscow's policy was to bring all the post-Soviet countries back under its control, that is, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, while at the same time preventing Western influence from entering the region. That's why Putin has always reacted very painfully to any attempts by the Caucasus countries to get closer to NATO and the European Union. Russia has always positioned itself as the dominant arbiter in the region, as the only center of power, relying both on its military presence and economic leverage, while not forgetting to use long-standing cultural and historical ties. Since the mid-1990s, it has come under tight Russian influence. The successive ruling clans of Kacharyan and Sargsyan built a corrupt oligarchic system in Armenia, closely connected with the Russian political and business elite. Their rule brought some stability but reduced Armenia's sovereignty, democracy, and economic growth. Therefore, in the spring of 2018, the masses dissatisfied with this state of affairs carried out a series of anti-government demonstrations and other protest actions. As a result of this velvet revolution, the more democratic and pro-Western Nikol Pashinyan came to power, which of course did not suit Russia, and it immediately began to put obstacles in the way of the new authorities. However, Pashinyan did not go for a complete break with Putin, essentially pursuing a multi-vector policy that is well known in Ukraine, trying to satisfy both sides. Especially since Moscow still had an important lever of influence in the form of a large Russian military base in the Armenian city of Gyumri. The situation in Georgia was a bit more complicated. Putin viewed the 2003 Rose Revolution victory and pro-Western Mikhail Saakashvili's rise to power very negatively, who was seriously determined to carry out large-scale reforms in the country and achieve full membership in the European Union and NATO. As a tool of pressure, Moscow used the unrecognized separatist states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which the Georgian authorities had not controlled since 1992. And when that didn't work, in August 2008, Putin's protege Medvedev carried out an invasion deep into Georgian territory, which is better known as the Five-Day War. However, this aggression did not alter Tbilisi's foreign policy course. However, what military force couldn't achieve was accomplished through political manipulation, intrigue, intimidation, and bribery. Moscow placed its bet on the main pro-Russian political force inside Georgia, the Georgian Dream Party, which was backed by the major oligarch Benzina Ivanishvili. And since 2012, it has controlled the Georgian parliament, the government, and now even the president. And the one who dreamed so much about a European Georgia, former President Saakashvili, is now sitting in a Tbilisi prison. But Azerbaijan is entirely different from this. Back in the late 90s, the then President Heydar Aliyev, father of the current Ilham Aliyev, placed his bet on friendship and strategic partnership with Turkey. And Moscow never managed to break this Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance, even though considerable efforts were made. The results of the Second Karabakh War in 2020 and the Third Karabakh War in 2023 confirmed this geostrategic choice. As a result of these wars, Nagorno-Karabakh, which had existed for 32 years as an unrecognized state, returned under Azerbaijan's control. Thus, Azerbaijan not only managed to fully restore its territorial integrity, which many had previously considered an almost impossible task, but also, thanks to this victory, became the main geopolitical player in the Caucasus. Azerbaijan became the region's strongest state, effectively stripping Russia of its status as the Caucasus's center of influence. By the way, few people remember now, but the Second Karabakh War to some extent influenced Ukraine, or more precisely, strengthened its defense capabilities. After witnessing the Turkish Bayraktar drone's success in 2020, which gave Azerbaijan air superiority and a tactical edge, the Ukrainian armed forces decided to buy several dozen of these systems. The weapon did not play a decisive role, but at the start of the big war, it was very helpful. So Azerbaijan, although indirectly, still had an important influence on the course of the war in Ukraine. In turn, Azerbaijan probably wouldn't have been able to take back Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 if Russian troops hadn't been distracted by repelling the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Azov region. So in this case, a new player has emerged in Asia. After regaining Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan is not stopping there. Aliyev continues to expand his influence both in the Caucasus and in the broader region that includes the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. First and foremost, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan are on the opposite side of the Caspian Sea. Their territories are mainly Turkic-speaking and Muslim, so they share similar cultural values with Azerbaijanis. The main ally in these efforts for Azerbaijan, is Turkey, represented by the current President Erdogan, as well as forces in the West interested in reducing Russian influence in the post-Soviet space, and, first and foremost, the United Kingdom, which seeks to strengthen its position in this region. And Azerbaijan's main competitor, naturally, is Russia. Especially after Baku regained control over Karabakh, despite the presence of Russian peacekeepers there as guarantors of the previous ceasefire agreements, Moscow's authority in the Caucasus has been hopelessly trampled into the mud. Also, from the Kremlin's point of view, Azerbaijan is pursuing a hostile policy by positioning itself as a key hub for exporting energy resources from Central Asia to the West, bypassing the territory of the Russian Federation. These alternative routes through Azerbaijan not only significantly reduce the revenues of Gazprom and Rosneft, but also weaken Moscow's political leverage, as Azerbaijan uses its extremely advantageous geographical position on the Caspian Sea and its developed infrastructure, pipelines and ports for transshipping oil and gas. Azerbaijan has become not just a supplier of its own resources, but also a transit center for Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. The latter, although they possess significant energy reserves, have historically depended on Russian pipelines for their exports. Azerbaijan, by contrast, offers other product distribution routes. Among them, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline holds a strategic position, running from Azerbaijan through Georgia to the major Turkish port of Ceyhan on the Mediterranean Sea. From there, the oil is shipped by tankers to European countries like Greece, Italy, and France. A similar role is played by the South Caucasus gas pipeline, which delivers Caspian gas through Azerbaijan and Georgia to the Turkish city of Erzurum. The Baku-Supsa oil pipeline, which connects the capital of Azerbaijan and the major Georgian port of Supsa, plays an important role. And the final buyers are Bulgarian and Romanian oil refineries. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan plan to lay the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline under the Caspian Sea in the next 10 years, enabling Central Asian countries to bypass the Russian pipeline and supply energy to southern Europe safely. By the way, the supply of Azerbaijani gas, oil, and petroleum products is playing an increasingly important role in Ukraine's energy security. Therefore, it is not surprising that in recent months Russia has started striking the oil depots of the Azerbaijani company Sakar, especially in the Odessa region. This once again confirms the obvious truth. Moscow will do everything to disrupt any diversification of energy supplies, using them as a weapon. Based on this experience, it would be advisable for Azerbaijan to work on strengthening the security of its pipeline infrastructure. Zangezur Corridor. Although Azerbaijan is currently strong, influential, and strategically important, it has one weakness Russia will likely seek to exploit. And this Achilles heel is the Zangezur Corridor, or as Armenians call it, the Shunik Corridor. For those unfamiliar with Caucasus geography, Azerbaijan's territory is split into two unequal parts. The larger part, which is actually the core of the Azerbaijani state, makes up 94% of the entire country's territory, but it does not have a common border with its main ally, Turkey. And 6% of Azerbaijan's territory is the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, which does have a border with Turkey. And these two parts of Azerbaijan are separated by the so-called Zangezur Corridor, which is about 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. And most importantly, this corridor is the territory of Armenia. Thus, because of the Zangezur Corridor, direct land communication between Turkey and most of Azerbaijan is impossible. That is, from Baku's point of view, this piece of Armenia stands in the way of ensuring Azerbaijan's strategic security and makes its communications extremely vulnerable. And since, after the return of Nagorno-Karabakh, establishing a direct connection between Azerbaijan and Turkey has become a key task for Baku, many experts are already outlining the contours of a future war in the South Caucasus. As you correctly guessed, against this background, there are constant statements that Azerbaijan might attack Armenia to seize the corridor by force and then either directly annex it or simply establish an occupation regime. This isn't a conspiracy theory. Unfortunately, after Russia's aggression, international law has been practically reduced to zero. So in our turbulent times, anything is possible, even things that 20 years ago were considered impossible. You may wonder, what does Russia have to do with this? Yes, because Moscow itself wants to control the Zangezur Corridor, not directly, but through Armenia. If they bring it completely back under their control, and considering Georgia's dependent position, Azerbaijan will actually find itself in a semi-encirclement, cut off from its main ally. Plus, in the south, Iran could easily become more active, as it has long been eyeing Azerbaijan, and at a critical moment it will side with Moscow. That's why it's not surprising that control over the Zangezur Corridor could spark, if not a world war, then at least a major regional conflict. Such a threat is quite real, considering Putin's tendency as a professional security officer to sow distrust, hostility and violence wherever possible. Business and crime. In addition to geopolitical factors, there may also be internal, purely commercial reasons for the Russian-Azerbaijani conflict, or they may complement political calculations. There is a high probability that Russian law enforcement simply decided to make a good profit. After all, the Azerbaijani diaspora in Russia is the wealthiest and most influential among all national diasporas. Azerbaijani entrepreneurs control huge assets, ranging from countless markets to the oil sector. In addition, Azerbaijanis hold high positions in the Russian criminal hierarchy, controlling a significant part of the criminal business. And that's not all. Many experts in this field claim that the Georgian and Armenian diasporas living in Russia act in line with the Kremlin's policies and are a factor of Moscow's influence on processes in Georgia and Armenia. But with the Azerbaijani diaspora, the situation is exactly the opposite. It's a result of Baku's influence on Russia's top leaders, including security agency heads. Given Russia's corruption, this influence is unsurprising. Thus, the demonstrative attack on the Azerbaijani diaspora may aim, at minimum, to remove it from Baku's control, and so that later, some colonel or general of the Federal Security Service would receive a fat envelope, a new villa in Sochi, or a crypto wallet from grateful businessmen of Azerbaijani nationality. What's so special about that? For Russian law enforcement, exploiting businesses is almost sacred. Over the years of being run by a former KGB lieutenant colonel, a whole system of such feeding schemes has been built, and it runs through Russia from top to bottom. Or, as another option, Federal Security Service generals and their associates decided to strip the Azerbaijanis of their wealth on a large scale. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the resulting total crackdown has led to complete lawlessness in the business sphere as well. A whole class of beneficiaries has emerged from the process of not distributing the assets of representatives of so-called unfriendly countries. The biggest profits, aside from the security service crowd, went to many top Kremlin officials and oligarchs loyal to the regime, for example Patanin, Timchenko, or Putin's former colleague Chemezov. That's why it's clear to them that Azerbaijan being added to the list of unfriendly countries benefits them, as it allows them to seize Azerbaijani diaspora property. And after that, how can anyone do business in such a super stable and safe country as the Russian Federation? I think the question is rhetorical. Will there be a war? So, to sum up, let's answer this question. Will there be a war between Russia and Azerbaijan, at least in the coming years? Will Putin get a new Caucasus front? And the answer here is clear. Until the war in Ukraine ends, Putin definitely won't take such a risk. Too much is at stake. That's why almost all combat-ready troops are now concentrated far from the Caucasus, although some hybrid actions from Moscow are quite possible. For example, an unidentified drone could enter Azerbaijani territory and crash at an oil terminal near Baku. Considering that the foundation of Azerbaijan's economy is oil production, the effect of such sabotage could be quite significant. Much more dangerous processes may begin when the war in Ukraine ends. Then Putin and his successor will have their hands untied. Personally, I believe that in this case, Moscow's next strike will not be against the Baltic states, as many assume, but specifically in the Caucasus. It's no coincidence that for several centuries this region has been considered Russia's Achilles heel. It's no coincidence that, according to many strategists, if the collapse of Russia begins, it will not start with Siberia or the Urals, but specifically with the Caucasus. Therefore, it's not surprising that the Russian authorities, regardless of who sits on the Kremlin throne, will do everything possible to restore their influence in the Caucasus. And if Azerbaijan remains the main rival in the region, it means it will inevitably come under fire. To deliver a devastating blow, Moscow will likely try to encircle the area, keep Georgia in its orbit, and regain control over Armenia, especially since pro-Russian sentiment remains strong in Armenia. The parliamentary elections, which are scheduled for next summer, could significantly change the balance in the region, especially if the current Prime Minister, Pashinyan, is removed. And then the factor of the Zangezur corridor might very well come up. As the saying goes, if there's a gun hanging on the wall in a play, it will definitely go off in the final act. So I wouldn't advise Azerbaijan to relax. They need to strengthen not only their energy security, but also their military security, to reinforce their troops, and first and foremost, their air defense. After all, the oil rigs are just a few minutes' flight away for Russian missiles, and only the most advanced systems can protect them from complete destruction. And to obtain them, it's necessary to strengthen ties with the leading Western countries, not just with Turkey, and first and foremost with the United States. The experience of the current Russian-Ukrainian war suggests that you can only strike against the Moscow horde in alliance with the civilized world. This is something that both the current and all future generations need to understand well. That's all from me. I thank all the channel's sponsors for their financial support. Thanks to you, I'm able to release videos. Thank you and goodbye to everyone.